Madeleine and Craig will be sharing ANP Capital's approach to the crisis and lessons learned before giving us their thoughts on the leadership qualities and changes to human resource strategies that will be required in a post-COVID-19 world. I'd like to thank both Craig and Madeleine for taking the time to speak with us today and to help us all gain some insight into what lies ahead. For those of you watching at home, I'll also remind you that the chat and Q&A boxes are open and available for you to send through any questions or comments throughout today's session. You can also email your questions to us at info@anzccj.jp. Now, we do miss being in person with you all, and it's always great to see who's joining us online during these events. So if you like, please do pop your name and where you're joining us from into the chat box while we begin. So with that, I'd now like to hand over to Craig and Madeleine. Thank you both again for joining us today.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
Madeleine, do you want to go first? Just on the recap.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the introduction. And as Emily said, I've been at ANP Capital now for 12 years, and I joined ANP Capital about 6 months before the GFC hit. So if timing has an impact in life, I've definitely got my timing right or wrong there, depending on which way you look at it. But I think, since I joined ANP Capital from the GFC, we've seen GFCs, we've seen sort of earthquakes, we've seen tsunamis, we've seen, geopolitical disruption. So I guess COVID, I often say to people, COVID wasn't in my, excuse me, having trouble with my computer, so I had to go on my phone. But whilst it, it wasn't in my sort of HR guidebook, and I don't think it was in any leadership guidebook. So it's definitely brought on new challenges. But I will say, from an ANP Capital perspective, we did have very well developed business continuity plans, and we already had a very, Craig had been up in Asia, and I'll let Craig talk about sort of the initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But from a human resource, I'll sort of take a very sort of the human resource approach to it. I think firstly is to always listen to your frontline staff. There is a tendency, I think, sometimes to want to take a very centralised approach and get control. But I think it's really important to empower people that are closest to where things are happening, because that's where you get the richness of insight and feedback into what actually is required in your response. So I think the first thing I would say is in our approach is the first response is listen to those closest to where things are happening and respond to that at the very beginning. The other thing is then seek out the necessary facts. I think in these days of social media, there is so much information going around, and there's so many people pretending to be experts or pretending to know what they're talking about. You have to say, what is the science and health expertise I'm going to listen to, and try and be consistent in listening to that guidance. And then I think it's giving a consistent, then we really moved on to going, from a HR perspective, how do we give a consistent language to what is happening and acknowledge people's feelings using that language and give them an outlet for that. And then I think the main job of HR really in those really early days was to facilitate conversations that really raised and addressed the conflict that arises when people are responding to things that are outside their control, and people get worried and they get fearful. And so you often have very different ideas. So how does, HR really had to move into that space to make sure we brought people together to be able to express what they were feeling, but then go, okay, we're leaders. We need to lead our people through this. What do we have to do together, and how do we have approach for communicating and resolving what might be conflicting information, especially across, we sort of work across 11 global locations. So we really, each of those points I think was really, really important to making sure we acted local, we thought global as a leadership team, but kept going back to what's going to work locally and what's required locally in terms of our response. Craig, do you want to add to that in terms of just from the business unit perspective?
Thank you. Thanks, Madeleine. I think the first bit was, it was one of the most challenging times, certainly of my career, but also, to be honest with you, it's turned out to be one of the most rewarding, because I've just seen people do amazing things. But the first thing that became really evident for me in the early stages was trust. And I was thinking about this morning. When it first hit, and particularly in China in sort of late January, we needed to trust our people on the ground. We need to trust our people in various other functions. And the communication we had as a global team, there was 100% trust across our global team, and the ability for us to back our leaders to make decisions that were in the interests of our staff, our business, as well as our clients. And I think that's been one of the ways that I think has stuck through us through this crisis, is that trust. And if I think about it, when we started and where we are today, the trust within the organisation is substantially increased as a result of that learning.
Agreed. I mean, based on that, Craig, what would you say our major learnings have been?
If I think about it from I'll start with professional, and then I can talk personal. Look, professionally, the first bit was that you need to listen to your local people, and I think one of the things that we did very, very early on was to listen and adapt our response to each office location, and that is important when you're dealing with different languages, different cultures, and I think the learnings from that is just really reinforced that we need to think very, very much locally, but as you say, also act with a global mindset. The second learning was that with a purpose, people can do amazing things. And I still reflect on the situation where we've evacuated 11 different global locations, effectively our whole business. We've been able to still manage money, manage all of the functions, and communicate with our clients, and actually win new business. And if you had said that to me 3 months ago or 4 months ago, I would have said that wouldn't be possible. And I think that shows me that when people have got a really strong purpose and you empower people, and in a crisis you have to empower people, and I think we did our best to do that. I think people will do amazing things. And I think the third learning from my perspective is open and honest communication with all your stakeholders. I think it's fine to acknowledge that when you're in a crisis, you may not get everything right. You may not get everything may not be perfect. Reports might be late, or you're dealing with people that are working remotely and they've got connectivity issues. And I think just a greater acceptance of that things won't be perfect, and but as long as people are showing up with the right intent, that's all you really want. And I think that's one of the biggest learnings. That's another big learning. And then look, personally, I think it's probably reinforced to me a number of things. One is to take stock of all the good things in life that we have and be grateful, but also secondly, to probably, it's forced me to put a lot more balance into my own life. And I think when you're working remotely, I'm still trying to get back to Japan. I'm hoping that I'll be back on the 2nd of July. But when you're working remotely, it's important that and you're working at home, it's important that you separate that home and work life. And that's not something that I've been able to master at all in my career. I'm not saying I've nailed it at the moment, but I'm on the road to I think improving it, and it's been well received by my family.
I think the other thing that because I agree with everything you've said there, and especially building that culture of trust, because if we didn't trust our employees, if you don't trust the people that work for you, then either you're the wrong leader or you've been hiring the wrong people. And I think building that culture of trust when you really need it, you can't build it then. It has to be in place already. And I think that is something that's really important. But also just the importance of things like testing your business continuity plans, testing them and testing them and testing them. And some, you know, that's the point about things that disrupt business. They're not predictable, and you don't know when they're going to happen. You have to be ready when they do happen. And if you've got good business continuity plans, and you know, I think it's frustrating, and sometimes it's boring testing them, and you think, oh, will we really ever need to use these? And when you do, it is just so important to have them in place.
I agree, and I think, look, the other thing from my perspective is that it's brought out that as leaders, we've had a whole lot of skills there that we just didn't know. I think about some of my own personal learnings. One is the ability to, like, I never thought that I would have to deal with a health crisis. I never for 1 minute thought that would be something that would be part of my job. And in the early days, you know, we were sitting in meetings, you know, with briefings from our health and safety people, briefings from medical professionals on how to manage, you know, our assets through this sort of crisis. And those are things that all of a sudden we had to become experts in, how to manage a workplace, how to manage a physical workplace. And I think though we sort of sometimes think, well, you know, we're in financial services, or we're in construction, or we're in health, or we're in law, and that's where our skills sort of start and stop. But actually, what I learned is actually there's a whole lot of other skills that if I can invest the right amount of time just to listen to people, then I actually was able to acquire a whole range of skills that I never really had. So that was a big learning, a huge learning for me, and massive amount of learning.
And I think, I guess the following on from learning, but I think as a reflection from a people and culture perspective, is when you think about the leadership qualities that have come to the fore. I think a lot of the things that are required by leaders and what's important, you know, isn't different under a crisis. It just sort of accelerates it. So, for example, great leaders genuinely care about people, and they don't care in a way that it's a real genuine care. They're prepared to call things how they are. They're prepared to give, you know, bad news, but they do it in a way that respects the person that they're dealing with and the group of people they're dealing with. So that you've got to genuinely care about people to be a really great leader. But I think the other thing that came out was you've got to have that passion for what you're delivering to clients, because then that immediately, if there's one thing I saw in our business, it was the immediate response to say, are our clients okay? What do we need to do first and foremost to make sure our clients are okay? Then we go, okay, now are we okay in that situation, in being able to keep delivering to clients through this process? So I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is not often spoken about in regards to leadership, which is particularly important in times like this, is you have to be comfortable with paradox. You have to be able to lead with and sit with paradox quite comfortably. So, for example, how do you care for the individual whilst also caring for the team, the organisation, client, and community? There are things in conflict there that you just have to be able to sit with and deal with. How do you deal with that sort of certainty versus, you know, vulnerability and disruption? You know, how do you manage those two things at once? How do you sit with the tactical need whilst always keeping that long-term vision in place? And these are the things that pull at a leader. And I think that the temptation is to run towards the comfort of simplistic answers. And I think great leaders can resist that temptation, but can also provide certainty to their people that no matter what happens here, we will keep taking action that puts us in a better position, and we won't stop, and we'll always find a way for the next step and the step after that to keep delivering what we need to. And I think that's a really critical sort of quality of the leaders that I've seen that have managed well through this period.
I'd agree. I think, you know, if I think about, I've seen some amazing leadership within AMP Capital, but also I've seen amazing leadership across all aspects of the firm, of our clients, but also everybody that you know, I deal with in the sort of the ecosystem of work, as well as outside of work. I think it's been really interesting to see how you know, people have been able to, I think, just deal with the complexity and the uncertainty. And I think whether that, I still reflect when I left Japan, it was that was the last Qantas flight. I was sitting on the plane to come back to Australia, and I was talking to the cabin crew who knew that the next day that they were going to be stood down from their jobs, and it was probably one of the more surreal experiences I've had in my life. And I still remember the leadership that every single member of that crew shown to caring for the people on the plane, trying to keep a sense of humour, knowing that they had a huge amount of uncertainty of what the future was going to hold for them personally and professionally. And I think that we're just seeing so many people like that have been able to deal with uncertainty. And I think what it's probably taught us is that as leaders, we're sort of used to dealing with complex situations. We're used to dealing with you know, ever-changing environment. We call it agile thinking, but actually this has been I think a real test of leadership in dealing in an uncertain environment. And I think we've won. I think as a society, we've actually demonstrated that we all, because we're all leaders, whatever we do in our roles, we've demonstrated as a society that we can all actually lead in an uncertain environment. I think the other thing from my perspective that's been fascinating to see is just how societies and individuals have collaborated and genuinely cared. I you know, certainly what we've seen in Sydney while I've been back, you know, even when they were just open for takeaway, the amount of people that were going to local cafes just to get takeaway, or local restaurants just to get takeaway to support those cafes and restaurants has been unbelievable, because people want the businesses to thrive. We went to a local farmers market a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to get there on the weekend. And once again, it's packed because everyone's practicing social distancing. But people want to support local community and local businesses. And I think we've seen that, I think, right across the board. I think both at a local individual level, but even, you know, by and large, a lot of the countries around the world, how they've cooperated, I think has been, yes, there's been some challenges with a few of them, but by and large, people have, the cultural differences that we've all had, have really been broken down. I think, you know, I think there's a lot of good that has come from this. While it's been a lot of heartache and a lot of trauma, and people have lost their lives, and there's been a lot of good that has come from this from a society perspective.
Yeah, I suppose on that note, Craig, I think during your last webinar with us, we spoke about a lot of the initial, I guess, responses to the disaster, and how we would kind of get through that initial shock and respond to the immediate challenges. And we're sort of now in this period of transition and able to look at things with a more, I guess, forward-thinking mindset now. Do you have a concept of what the post-COVID world is going to look like for AMP? Do you have policies in place kind of navigating how you'll make the return to the office and those sorts of new social distancing measures that you'll need to take into account?
It's a good question. The future of work's a whole separate topic, and I know it's something that Madeleine can talk about it a little bit as well. But look, I think initially from our perspective, as people have, I'm in our Sydney office today. You know, we've got a situation here where there's, you know, sanitizer coming in. We've got, you know, markers as to who can sit down at certain desks. It's incredibly well organised and managed. If I think about our office in Tokyo in particular, we've still are recommending that people work from home and come to the office only when required. My view in the short to medium term, well, not personal, but also company view in the short to medium term, is we absolutely have a duty of care to keep our employees safe, and for the long-term success of the business as well. And we've also got an obligation to society. So therefore, we want to minimise, where possible, people coming into the office, and making sure that they're only coming in for essential reasons. I think as things start to improve, people will start to come in on there'll be more people coming in. But I think fundamentally it's going to change the way that people do work. I think I think it's going to lead to a culture of, we've seen what's possible, of greater flexibility, greater agility. I think it's going to be terrific for a whole range of people that are looking for flexibility in their lives. And I think it also potentially opens up potentially people that have been excluded from the workforce globally because flexibility wasn't available, to actually now being potentially be able to come into the workforce because of this newfound flexibility. So I think short and medium term, it's all about, bringing people back on a careful measure, trying to be safe, really minimising a lot of traffic, for want of a better word, but then also taking the positives that we've learned and using that to really continue to enhance the culture of the firm.
I guess quite a few people ask me what I think post-COVID world will look like for ANP Capital and generally. Look, my answer is I have no idea, and I don't think anyone else does either. My approach to that is I'm trying to resist the temptation of talking about designing this new normal, because that takes me to a world where I'm thinking about a destination, and I want to create a new dynamic, not a destination, because destinations don't last. You get there and the next one reappears. So I think the aim in ANP Capital is to create a new dynamic for ourselves where we are looking at how we take advantage of opportunity, listening to our people far more, empowering them. I think, it's about the post-COVID world is a world where the people you work with and for, it is about trust, and leaders really believe in the ability of those people to find solutions when they're needed, for whom they're needed, and to really connect with each other to be able to deliver solutions in a very dynamic world. I think, as Craig said, I think we're facing into things that we are yet to fully understand. I think I cannot believe that the population of the world, that especially in some places where we have offices, are going through such trauma, whilst there also being a lot of positives. The impact on certain parts of the world are going to be intense and unforeseen, and I think to try and predict that prematurely will lock us into a way of responding that may actually not work. So I think our job at the moment is, how do you give people certainty? So how do you say, okay, this is what we're going to do in the next 3 months, the next 6 months, this is our great vision for where we're going to go and what we're going to deliver to our clients. But stay really alert and open to new information as it comes in, and get comfortable with responding to new information as it unfolds. And I think that's going to set us up with the best dynamic for future success and to keep delivering to our clients.
I agree. Agreed. And I think, look, we've seen it. A recent example, we actually started to bring people in our Hong Kong office back into the office because of COVID. And then we had another challenge, which was social unrest and protests actually out the front of our office. And very quickly we had to sort of pull back a bit. And I think what that's sort of probably showed, and I actually reflected on that the other day, the way that we did that was all informed by our learnings of COVID, and we just trusted our teams and they made some decisions, and we got on with that. And I think that's you're 100% right. That's the way we're going to have to work in the future.
Yes. Were there any specific measures or policies that you had in place from your experience of COVID that has specifically helped with the recent events in Hong Kong?
I think, well, we have communication lines. So it's
Mm.
that instantaneous communication. WhatsApp is the amount of WhatsApp groups going around for different family groups or work groups. Instantaneous communication. That was the first, and then secondly, trust. It was basically, this is happening, this is what we're doing, and I said, well, that's great. That you've got my 100% support. Please do it and take care. And I think it was more about trust and confidence. I think people had built up confidence as a result of dealing with a number of challenges through COVID, and that had actually helped them. And we've trusted them in that. And then I think combined with that trust and confidence, just the ability to make quick decisions and have instantaneous communication is probably the biggest learning.
I'd agree with that. I think when there was first unrest in Hong Kong, I think one of the things that Craig and I spoke about and put in place straight away was to talk to the leaders in our Hong Kong office and say, we're going to be guided by you here. We can see everything that's happening, but we're not going to believe the media ahead of you. We want your experience on the ground and your assessment of what we need to do based on the things we believe in our organisation and keeping you safe. And to me, that was one of the biggest learnings and best things that we do when we really need leadership, is to empower the leaders to make decisions locally. And Craig set up the WhatsApp group, as he said, and every day we'd get an update from the leaders in the Hong Kong office, and they assessed and managed the risk with our inputs, and we could talk about them, but then allow them to be empowered to make local decisions. And I think that was critical.
Agreed.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Now, we've just had a question come through the Q&A box from one of our members asking, going back to Madeleine, you mentioned dealing with or sitting with paradox, I believe. Member just was wondering, how do you deal with the paradoxes you've described, and do you have any examples for what you do to meet these paradoxes?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I guess that I see leaders do that works, and that I think I talk to them a lot about, is accepting them. Accepting that as a leader you are constantly torn between what seems to be opposites. So you're asked to almost manage things that seem in total conflict with each other. And once you accept it, you then go, okay, well, how do I deal with it? And I think that's the most important thing, to accept it and then deal with it. So I think one of the clearest paradoxes, I think, for leadership, and it's affecting us every day at the moment, is how do you balance the commercial with the community good? Because as organisations, we are there to make, well, our particular organisation and many of yours is to make profit for shareholders. That is our job. That's why we're employed, and that's our commitment. How do you do that when the community really needs you, and the community is saying maybe you need to take the foot off that profit to contribute to the longer term good of society? Once you accept that challenge and that conflict, you then, all your energy goes into, rather than resisting it or going, this is hard, how can we do this? You suddenly go, all right, well, how might we do this? Who do we need to talk to make sure that we can get the right balance here? Because it is always a balance. And how do we make sure that we represent all the things that we need to do as part of wider society, not just the short-term, view of necessarily bringing in, maximising profit in this year. And what I think we've found surprising is the minute you engage with clients on that conversation, the minute you engage with shareholders in that conversation, I'm happy to say we've been surprised at the ability of people to come together to help solve those things. So, that's one sort of way I would say it's manifesting at the moment. But you've got to stop the fight, because a lot of leaders come to me and say, well, we're here to do this, I can't be doing that. And I'm like, on the contrary, your job is to do both of those things. And I think you've got to work through that, because, a lot of the time, I think, you do resist it because it's hard. It's really hard.
I agree. It is hard. It's very hard. I think you need to become a better listener, and I think I've become a better listener through this. But secondly, you need to accept that everything's not going to be perfect. And I think that's always hard, because as leaders or as employees or as individuals, we're always sort of, we've got it ingrained that we want to try and do the right thing, and everything's got to be perfect, and we've got to tick every box, and it's got to be 100%. I think when you're dealing with paradox, you sort of got to accept that, not everything's going to be perfect, but your purpose is to do the right thing by everybody. And as long as you hold true to that purpose, then I think that's the right approach.
And it also requires, I think, a commitment to what is a much longer term, bigger picture view of the world. I think whenever you try and sort of take a very reductionist approach to the role of leadership, I think you can get yourself in trouble, because at an individual level, it's very difficult to hold that big picture if you can only deal at that detail level. And I think you can get so caught up in detail and getting everything right that you forget actually what you're there to do is to sort of look after the whole, not just the individual. But you also can't dismiss the individual because they're part of the whole. And that's another area where you've got to go, okay, well, how do I balance that? And again, I think the answer is engage with both. Engage with the individual, understand, but then lead them to also understanding the whole, and so people feel like they're involved and empowered in the decisions that affect them.
Thank you both. We have had another question that has come through to us, talking about these various measures that you've had to embrace. I'm sure there's been a lot of trial and error in the earlier stages of this crisis, but are there any specific changes that you have made that you've already determined need to be permanent parts of your strategy in a pre or a post-COVID world?
Yeah, look, I think, the obvious one I'll go to, from our perspective, I think we, for example, we're very focused on making our workforce more flexible. But on our own admission, and I include myself on that, there was always, you always put in some unconscious boundaries about how flexible can you actually be before we all start getting a bit nervous about, have we allowed too much flexibility and there'll be anarchy. And a lot of that was sort of undiagnosed anxieties. And I mean, it's incredible how quickly people have adapted, not just in our organisation, but I've watched it in, organisations where I have, colleagues work, that the idea that we could break down so many boundaries overnight, and even from IT, I mean, everyone's seen the social media thing going around IT. Who was the greatest influence on your contemporary IT strategy today? Was it your CEO, your head of IT, or COVID? And I think the answer has been COVID. And you go, wow, if we can change that quickly when we're forced to, and we've got a good reason to, imagine what we could do if we really pursued it. So I think one of the things that we've committed to an organisation is one around flexibility, going, it's actually something that everyone has far more flexibility, and we will open that up completely. But also a commitment to never underestimate what is possible for our organisations and the contribution we can make to clients and community if we really put our mind to it and believe in what we do.
I'd agree with that. I think the other bit to me, look, it has been what I would call meeting inclusion. It's working in Japan, but working for an Australian company, it was always difficult when you're dialing into video conferences and you're the only person on the video conference, and it's how you felt like if you've got a whole lot of people in one room and you're the one person that is outside of the room. I think one of the things that we will never go back to, not just as a company but also as a society, is actually acknowledging that we've got a greater acceptance around people that are outside of the room, how we include them in meetings, how we include their opinions, how we accept that their environment when they're not in the office may not be perfect, i.e. they might be on the road, they might be at home, they might be at somewhere else. So I think that what I would call that meeting inclusion, and I've just even noticed now the way that people are engaging across meetings using digital methods, and that whole inclusiveness has been amazing, and we will never ever go back. My leadership team is dispersed across New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Asia, China, and it's always been hard to try and get people to engage across such a multiple different time locations in a across video conference, teleconference. We've had some of the best leadership meetings recently in the last month using this new technology, and people are saying they've actually got they're feeling they've been able to get their message across in a greater way. So I think meeting inclusion for me is an important one. The second one, from my perspective, is I think a greater acceptance personally, but also trying to really push it with my teams around work-life balance. I think this new environment that we're in that has created the ability for people to, despite having huge workloads in some cases, also have greater balance. And I think we should, as leaders, really try and encourage that, because we know that that will bring the best, that will allow those individuals to bring the best possible of themselves to work as well.
And I think there's some very tangible examples, if I get quite tangible in terms of the question. We're looking now that when we onboard people, new recruits, that they actually get, a chair, monitor, keyboard headsets for home as well as for work. I think we're looking at doing a lot less travel, except where it's required for clients, and managing assets and bringing teams together. But I think what will happen is you'll get much more thoughtful approach to who travels when, and when we get together. We're definitely looking at, the way our workspace is designed. In Name Capital, we've got the great advantage of planning to move into the new QQT development, our head office down in Circular Quay in Sydney. And we've now got the benefit of this experience to go, what actually does that space now need to look like? We're looking at things like, how do we expand our end of journey facilities in our different offices, because we know a lot more people may not want to catch public transport as often, and get other ways of getting to work. So we're looking at a lot of options to make sure that we respond to a much more flexible lives for people, that allow them to maintain their physical and mental well-being, but also to be as productive as possible in a way that works for their personal lives as well.
That is a great point, and the next question does sort of relate to that matter as well, particularly looking after people in their home environment. But have you found there's been any real productivity related challenges with staff who've had children at home, kind of managing homeschooling as well in conjunction with that?
Yes, and it's a really interesting, it's been such a different experience for different people. I mean, some people were really well set up at home already. The group of employees that I think have struggled the most has been those that have very young children, preschool, or in their very early schooling years of what we call in Australia primary school, because their kids aren't self-sufficient, and they've had to take on these dual roles of sort of helping the teaching. Although, for those of us that know teachers, know that teachers have learnt a lot through this as well. And I think we're learning a lot more about, how to sort of educate children, but also too how we interact with our staff more inclusively. So yeah, I think we've learned a lot, and we'll keep learning. But yes, those with young children, I think most of our staff, though, after the initial shock and settling into the period, and now that a lot of kids have gone back to school, have said they see the advantages of working from home far outweigh the advantages. We just did our survey of all our worldwide staff, and only 13% came back and said they still want to spend the majority of their work hours in the office, which is really interesting. But we know there's some that really need to be in the office because their home environment doesn't allow for it. But overwhelmingly, it's been a positive response. But I think it is challenging if you have young children at home.
And I think that's where what we've tried to do is make people aware, particularly when it was in those early stages, that it was okay. They couldn't deal with everything. Like I had people in my team that were homeschooling and at the same time joining into a leadership meeting and on two different desks in one room, and that was common. I think, and people at first were almost a bit embarrassed about that. And I think one of the things that I realised very quickly, and it was actually after my wife told me I needed to think about it, was that you actually need to really try and make those people that are in that situation feel comfortable. And I think that's the role of us as leaders, is you've got to say to people, it's okay. Yes, you're juggling multiple things, and we know that you're bringing your best intent to the situation. Let us just work through this together. And I think accepting that it's not going to be perfect, I think, is the first. I think we've learned to accept that, I think, is a lot more.
Yeah, and I think making it okay for people to turn off their cameras. You don't actually, we don't need to see you to trust that you're engaging with the conversation as best you can in the situation you find yourself in that hour or whatever. That if you have to juggle kids in the background, go, please do, and it's okay, and there is no need to feel guilt, worry about it, because you're not here for this hour, you're here for your career, and whatever you have to do in this hour, that's fine. What I found amazing is the ability, if you take that pressure off people for those meetings where you don't need them to be necessarily there intensely and 100%, when they do need to be there, they find a way to do it. So I think it's just, again, it just comes back to trusting and empowering people to be productive in a way that best suits them.
And one of the early things we did, which was actually kind of fun, I think it was and Madeleine's team had organised this, was we actually had our global head of public markets do storytelling for the children. I still remember that was early on, and Simon's comes from a fixed income background, so he's very analytical, and seeing him read Dr. Seuss to the children of AMP Capital, I think was a really great example. Now I reflect on it, to show, that we understand people's predicament and we want to help them. It was quite entertaining as well.
Right, it's always nice to hear these sorts of stories that have been coming out of this time as well, of anxiety and things. That hearing those sorts of feel good examples of leaders really looking out for their company in that way. It's nice to hear. Kind of coming back to what you mentioned before, Madeleine, and particularly with the new recruits, how you were looking out for people's desk space and sort of physical environment whilst at home. Have there been any other specific health and safety issues that you've had to deal with for people working in their home environment?
Yeah, I think, have there been specific... Look, I think there's been a range, and I think many of my colleagues and other organisations have dealt with the same issues. I mean, firstly, you need to make sure people feel safe in their home environment. And what do you need to... Because we know that one of the unfortunate consequences and things we deal with in our society is domestic violence and people that can't feel safe in their own home. And that's a very serious issue that we need to face into. And, one of the things, again, we did early on is to say that if people didn't feel like they could work from home, that we would keep some of our sites open where we could for them to be able to come into the office. We also gave them places, different access to different resources to help them. I think people that really feed off the energy of other people and rely on that, I think, struggle, especially initially, more than others. But we, my employee experience team, I gave the job to them to say, how do we keep connected to as many people as possible whilst not overwhelming them with emails or, you know, workplace posts, or how do you create things that they can tap into? And we very quickly created experience sharing Zoom meetings, MS Team meetings, where we picked a topic of things that might be sort of how do we manage young children, and inviting all staff to say, you know, if you're having issues with this, you know, come to this forum and let's talk about it. And it was from that we actually got the idea of doing these book reading sessions for kids once a week of our employees. So it's again going back to, you know, the employees saying, what do you need, and then creating that experience. We also, for our, just talking about onboarding, we created an onboarding forum where we got 3 of our global leadership team, and we had a Q&A session for our people, because we knew they didn't have the chance to bump into people, you know, in the kitchens and the corridors to meet people. So we sort of tried to connect all the new people and with our leadership team. So we sort of tried to do that to keep people connected. We haven't seen, you know, we use an EAP service, which I think a lot of organisations use. We haven't seen any particular increase in the usage, but we have been encouraging people to use that service if they need to talk to people. We've kept surveying people at very quick surveys, like 5 questions, to keep getting feedback about where they are sort of mentally, emotionally, physically. Got lots of resources, and I think a lot of organisations have done that very well. I think the bigger challenge for us, I think, in terms of sort of mental health, has come in areas where they've been in lockdown for an awful long time. So I think our staff in the New York office at the moment, I think but what we've done is, as a HR team, we just decided we're going to ring every employee once a week, and if they really like that, we'd offer to ring them more often. So we just keep checking in with them and offering whatever support we can, knowing we're in a very difficult situation.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very impressive, I guess, communication mechanism that you've set up amongst this. So it's wonderful to be able to share this with some of our other members. I think sharing best practices in this way is going to help us all learn from each other's
absolutely
mistakes as well. So thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
That's all right. And I would just like to say, I've learned from a lot of my colleagues in other organisations. So I have to say the generosity of information sharing has been just incredible, and that we've been the beneficiary of that as well.
Fantastic. On that note, we might head into the final question that we've had today. I think especially for a company such as AMP with such a global team, have you found for offices outside of Australia that you've come across any cultural challenges amongst the staff dealing with COVID-19?
I'm happy to sort of start on that. I think the first one was you needed to accept really early on that each office was needed to have different protocols and arrangements. So one of the things that we really tried to do was think about, well, what are the arrangements that we've got to make for those offices? How do we tailor our communication for those offices and make sure that the measures that we're putting in place are going to work for those offices? And I think we were able to do that, and I think that's helped. So look, very early on, at one extreme, I had a team in China that had to report to the government every day on who was well and who wasn't, if anyone wasn't well, and where they went to tracing really early on. That's a very specific issue, a very specific process, and you just need to let that team do that, and you need to support them as much as possible. You know, in Japan, we've had the situation where, yes, the state of emergency in Tokyo has been lifted, but we've we're just continuing our current work arrangements for the next month, because that's what the team wanted. I think it's about listening, and I think if you try and force a Sydney or a head office perspective on things, it's just not going to work. And I think one of the great things that we've had is particularly as Madeleine sort of spoke about at the start, is there's been that real ability for Madeleine and her team and a range of other teams just to empower local leadership, and that's helped us.
Yeah, I'd just reiterate that. I mean, I think we learnt very early on in AMP Capital. We're only we're about 1,300 people, and we've got multiple sites across Australia and New Zealand because of our office and industrial and our shopping centre business, but also 11 international locations. We learned very early on that it's a highly centralised top-down approach to managing these very dynamic, very culturally different locations and markets was not the road to success. And actually what we had to do as a head office was to be very open to learning from what our much smaller offices did in those highly competitive and often very culturally different offices. So I think we very naturally moved into a world of empowering them and listening to what was happening on the ground and allowing people to respond as necessary. I would say where the conflict arises is where people want to move really fast in a way that we haven't yet been able to frame it as an organisation, because you've got to keep that cultural thread across the whole lot. But again, as I said in the beginning, I realised very quickly that our role in HR was to facilitate those interactions and those communications and never shy away from what I think was conflict that would lead to much better solutions for our people, rather than saying, look, well, that's bad. It's really important not to label these differences, but to say this is the moment where we can learn a lot. How do we bring the right people together to learn what we need to, and to make sure we keep that thread of culture going across the whole lot, and enable, our CEO, Adam, to communicate in a way that says, we're going to take very different responses depending on where we are in the world, but here's what binds us all together through this. And I think that was a very powerful message.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. I think there's been some fantastic takeaways for everyone tuning in, and really just coming back to that, the importance of communication, the way that you've been able to unify such a huge and global team throughout this time. There's been some great advice and I think examples that we can all apply in our own professions going forward. So for those of you listening at home, we do have another webinar planned for next week on Wednesday the 10th of June, and we'll be joined by New Zealand Trade Commissioner to Japan, Craig Pettigrew, and Chiefo Ogura of Meros Consulting. And they'll be giving us an update on the Japan market, the impact of COVID-19 on the food and beverage industry in particular, and the challenges and opportunities for New Zealand businesses interested in engaging with Japan. You can find the details and registration available from the ANZCCJ website, where you will also find recordings from previous webinars, including the one for today. So thank you again to Craig and Madeleine. It was